So thank you for joining me for today's training on evidence-based practices. What we're going to be doing today is we will be discussing the different EBPs for special needs. And my name is Awit Delusang. I am a board-certified behavior analyst for Riverside County Office of Education. And my official title is Intensive Behavior Intervention Manager, or IBI. And I am also part of CAPTAIN, which stands for the California Autism Professional Training and Information Network. And I am a state leader for that organization. So basically what we do in CAPTAIN is we disseminate the different evidence-based practices all over the state of California to ensure that all our students with special needs are receiving the best possible treatments for their disability. So I would just like to put it out there that if you are a teacher for the MOVE program or for the ID program or for the ED program, and you see the word autism in some of the slides, please do not be discouraged, because this presentation is for teachers and instructional assistants and educators who want to learn more about evidence-based practices. So I will let you know, I will warn you that some of the slides would be specific for autism, but towards the middle part of this presentation, you will see that there will be overlap, the evidence-based practices for autism and the moderate to severe. So just because you see the word autism on the slide doesn't mean that it's just specific for autism. You will learn later on that prompting is also an evidence-based practice for the moderate to severe. So please do not be discouraged if you just see the word autism in some of my screens, because it will apply to most of the students that we serve in the county. So what are evidence-based practices? Evidence-based practices are those for which scientifically researched treatments demonstrate the efficacy for students with special needs. So not just ASD, but for students with special needs. And when we say EBPs, they rely on the application of rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures in order for us to make sure that our students are receiving the best quality intervention that we could provide in our classroom. I did a Google search just this morning before I started recording myself, and I typed in treatments or EBPs for special needs. And as you can see, I can't even read that number. There's just a lot of commas and zeros, but I think it's about 580 million treatments available out there for special education. So what can we get from that? The implications for me, if I see this big amount of treatments available out there in the internet, is that we have to be careful as educators, because there are a lot of strategies, interventions, and techniques that are being sold or being recommended by a lot of different people that are not really evidence-based practices. I do not think that they're about 1 million, let alone 600 million EBPs out there. We really have to be careful in choosing the different strategies that we use in our classrooms, because they might not be evidence-based practices. And what we're going to be doing is a disservice for our students, because we think that it's an evidence-based practice just because we read it in the internet, and they're not going to make any progress because these are not, well researched. There's no peer review as to what those treatments are. So we want to make sure that we are implementing the real deal when it comes to our classrooms. So what you will see today are different slides wherein I will show you a list of what the EBPs are as of April of 2020. So it's very recent, because they've added a few new EBPs during the pandemic. So why are evidence-based practices important? They're important because when we use them, they are defensible. So all the interventions that you are going to be using as part of the IEP goal will hold water in court, just in case we get into due process and there's going to be a hearing. You could defend that what you are using in your classrooms are evidence-based practices. Because as DIS providers and as teachers, we are accountable for the growth of our students. We want to make sure that we are providing high quality interventions in our classrooms. Also, when we are providing evidence-based practices, we know that the interventions we are implementing are data-driven, and all the instructional decisions that we make are based on sound research. Here's the list of EBPs as in special education as of spring of last year. received the latest publication from the National Clearinghouse on evidence on autism, evidence and practice, or NCAEP. These are the 28 evidence-based practices as of 2020. So what I would like to show you in the next slide is the 5 new evidence-based practices as of 2020. And they're the ones highlighted in yellow. So augmentative and alternative communication is a brand new EBP that was actually, when I was talking earlier about PECs not being part of the new evidence-based practices list, it's because it's now part of the AAC. It's under AAC now because that's what they have come up with, that PECS is part of the augmentative and alternative communication because we're using pictures instead of expressive language for our students who are nonverbal. Behavioral momentum intervention is another new evidence-based practice which falls under the umbrella of ABA. Direct instruction, which we all do in our classrooms, is now considered an evidence-based practice, whereas, a couple of years ago it wasn't. The new exciting 2 evidence-based practices that we have been using mostly in our Reach Autism program is the sensor integration, as well as music-mediated intervention. So sensor integration has always been controversial in the world of ABA, but if you are aware of the role of occupational therapists in the county, you will say, I'm sure you are able to say that they have helped a lot of our students with their behaviors. So I am most excited about the fact that sensor integration is now part of the evidence-based practices list. Although we want to make sure that we are aware that sensor integration as an evidence-based practice explicitly specifies that we are using the Ayers program and not like the brushing and all those still not EBP considered intervention. So it's the sensory integration protocol by Ayers that is considered evidence-based practice. So mostly a lot of like self-regulation and sensory integration, like a lot of motor movements. If you have had an OT visit your classroom, they talk about proprioceptive, vestibular, and all those things. That's the Ayers sensory integration protocol that we are talking about. That's considered. So this is the part wherein I will let you know that the chart that you saw earlier, the list of the different evidence-based practices specific for students with autism. But as you can see in this title right here, that these are evidence-based practices for students with severe disability. So that actually captures all the teachers in RCOE. And you could see that prompting and fading is an evidence-based practice for severe disabilities, as well as reinforcement, discrete trial, task analysis. Generalization is not a specific evidence-based practice on the list that I provided, but it is directed inquiry, pictorial self-instruction, or PECS or AAC will fall under that. And then video modeling is an evidence-based practice. Computer-based instruction is an evidence-based practice, as you will see in the list that I have provided. You could also see that choice-making, self-management, those are like the best evidence-based practice for our students with selecting an evidence-based practice is really, you ask yourself, what is the goal or objective that you are trying to target for this new school year? And then you look at the matrix. What are your options? So it's really very simple. So this is the matrix. On the left of the screen are the different evidence-based practices that are part of the National Clearinghouse report as of the spring of last year. So on the left are the different evidence-based practices. On top of the chart are the different domains that are considered really important when we're teaching our special needs students. So we want to make sure that we're addressing academic skills, we're addressing self-help skills, or their adaptive skills, behavior. That's a big issue for a lot of teachers, especially in the ED program as well as in the autism program. Cognitive skills, communication skills, joint attention. A lot of that is really for our students with autism who do not have a lot of joint attention skills. This domain right here is a brand new domain that I'm very excited that's part of the chart. It's mental health. We're also gonna have several evidence-based practices for motor skills, for play skills, for school readiness, self-determination, social, and vocational. So under the different domains are the different age groups. So all the columns in yellow are evidence-based practices for our very young students. All the ones in blue are for our elementary up to middle school and freshman students. And all the ones in green are the evidence-based practices that we have for the older population in our programs. So what you can see here is, let's pick an evidence-based practice, for example. Let's say social narratives or social stories. You would see that social stories is an evidence-based practice for let's choose behavior. So you could see that it's an evidence-based practice when you have an IEP goal that addresses behavior for not just the very young ones, but also for elementary as well as high school students. If you want to use sensory integration and address probably some of the academic skills because they're not paying attention or they're having a hard time handwriting or writing, you could see that sensory integration is actually an evidence-based practice for academic skills for really young ones, as up until about 14 years old, but it's not really an evidence-based practice for older students when it comes to academic skills. So that's really how you read the different columns. So how do we select an evidence-based practice for your classroom? First, we want to make sure that we base our decisions on the skills being taught. So you want to make sure that it aligns to the skills that you want your students to achieve. So you can't really use sensory integration if you are teaching, let's see, if your sensory integration does not really fall under joint attention or mental health or self-determination, because that does not really apply to any of those skills. So you want to make sure that you look at the skills being taught and look at what different domains they fall into. Your professional wisdom, the learner's learning style, his temperament, the interests and motivators of your student, supports already in place, and a history of what has and hasn't worked. So let's look at learner's temperament. So for those of you who are familiar with discrete trial teaching, it's basically asking the same questions 10 times in a row. That might be very effective for preschoolers and really young elementary students. But if you ask an adult, case in point, if you ask my 19-year-old son the same questions 10 times in a row, tendencies he will get behavior. He will probably exhibit some behaviors because he's already tired of the same questions over and over again. So the temperament of your student has to be taken into consideration when you're choosing an evidence-based practice. If their attention span is short, you want to make sure that you're using something that's quick and easy, so that you get the best bang for your buck. Also, like, support's already in place. If you already have like a board maker CD in your classroom, what's preventing you from using AAC or PECs as part of your intervention for your students who are not able to express themselves, right? A history of what has and hasn't worked. So if you have, have had some issues with a specific intervention, let's say you're having a hard time implementing functional communication training because you do not have the training from either the speech or from IBI as how to implement that. You want to make sure that you have a list of the interventions that you want to pursue and get the training for that, and a history of what has and hasn't worked. Because like, some teachers are so good with discrete trial, but some just tend to not like that intervention. Well, the good news is, if you do not feel that you are equipped to do a specific intervention, well, there are 27 other EBPs that you could choose from. All right, so let's practice on how to use the evidence-based practices when we are implementing some of our IEP goals. So here's an example of a goal that we have. Lucia, who's 8, will respond to peers' questions and comments with eye contact and appropriate phrases or sentences. So looking at this particular objective or goal, you could see, if we dissect this particular goal, you could see that there are 2 goals that we are targeting. First is for her to respond to peers' questions and comments. So that's really an expressive language. That's a skill that is under the expressive language category, right? So it falls under communication. And then we want him or her to use eye contact and appropriate phrases and sentences. So eye contact is a social skill. So we're going to look at the social domain of our chart later on. So we know that this particular goal is falls under communication as well as social. So let's look. So Lucia is 8. So we will look at the chart that has the yellow boxes, because those are the evidence-based practices for an 8-year-old. So you could see that communication and social have a lot of like overlapping interventions. So ABI, or antecedent-based intervention, is both addresses both communication as well as social skills. So you could use ABI, you could use AAC, you could use you could even use discrete trial teaching for her. The funny thing about communication skills for our elementary up to 14 years old is all of them are evidence-based practices for that age group. And for social skills, almost all of them are evidence-based practices for that age group as well, except for let's see, direct instruction, and I believe FBA, or functional communication training, or functional behavior analysis. So you could see an overlap. So you could use one evidence-based practice to address both communication as well as social. Let's practice again. So here's James, who's 14, and we want him to use conventional gestures or words to protest or refuse rather than use aggression. So picture James in your classroom. He's probably not wanting to work. So every time he's given a worksheet, he will throw, his pencil or flip his desk. And what you want as a teacher is to use his words or gestures instead of using all these behaviors to get away with work. So what are the skills that we are targeting for James? We are targeting expressive language, because we want him to use his words to protest. Pragmatics, because we want him to use gestures. And we're also addressing behavior because we want to eliminate the aggression but increase his communication skills. So what are your options for James? So for James, we're going to look at communication, because that's one of the skills that we are targeting, as well as behavior. So you could see again that there are a lot of evidence-based practices that are good for an 8-year-old. Like earlier, all the communication skills, all the interventions are evidence-based practice for communication. So direct instruction and task analysis are the ones that we are not going to use for James, because they do not really address the skills that we are looking for, or they're not evidence-based practice for those skills and for that age group. But you could see that you could use one that would address both challenging behaviors as well as communication. But basically, this document is a cheat sheet for educators when writing IEP goals. So part of a comprehensive IEP goal is to make sure that you have the 6 elements. So first, you have to have the name of the student, the date, and when to achieve the goal. And most of our IEPs have all those 5, except for number 2, wherein we need to provide given statements implying evidence-based practice. So what are underlying conditions? So these are phrases or words that should be present in our IEP to make sure that what needs to be present for the student to accomplish the goal or the skill is there. Statements that are essential for successful programming, statements that are essential to avoid inappropriate programming, and statements that ensure consistency of instruction and support across staff. So basically, we are not specifying what evidence-based practice we're using in our goal, because that would be unfair for a teacher who does not know how to implement that particular evidence-based practice. So let's say when you're writing an IEP goal, you don't write using discrete trial teaching, James will match 18 identical shapes with 80% accuracy in 3 out of 5 trial days. So if I were a teacher and James moved into my classroom and I haven't had the training on discrete trial, that would be unfair for that teacher. So when writing IEP goals, we do not write the specific EBP. What we're going to do is we're going to write underlying conditions that point to that evidence-based practice that we're doing. That way, even if like a sub teacher comes into your classroom, the sub would know exactly how to implement that particular goal. So here's your cheat sheet. Here's my gift to you for this new school year. So if you want to use, let's say, antecedent-based intervention, you're going to be using implied statements such as by modeling new tasks or by varying duration of tasks and demands. That's basically saying you're using antecedent-based intervention. So my favorite here, using color-coded keyboard. So when I sent this document to one of the district teachers, one of her comments was like, I really like the cheat sheet on how to imply evidence-based practices when writing IEP goals, but some of your implied statements are really too expensive to implement. And she cited this particular implied statement that I added using color-coded keyboard. And basically, that's not buying a brand new keyboard. That's actually something that we did for my son. So for most of you, you would probably know that students with autism like patterns. They like if you show them a pattern, they could actually copy that pattern out of sheer memory. So my son, when he was younger, had a difficult time identifying letters, but we wanted him to be able to type his name because handwriting was really difficult for him, and he was really having a lot of behaviors when it comes to writing exercises. So as he grew older, we realized that we need to move forward from forcing him to write, although I made sure that he knows how to write his name, because when he's older, that he has to sign his own IEP. So that's something that was non-negotiable. Thank goodness his name is Ethan, so everything is like straight lines, and he didn't have an S in his name. So thank goodness I chose a name that has all straight lines except for A, but basically it's just a slanted straight line anyway. So as long as he can write his name, that was my ultimate goal for him, just so he could sign his own documents. But I wanted him to type his phone number, his name, his address, just in case he gets lost, that he has a way to communicate, and because he cannot really speak. So the way that I taught him how to type was actually using a color-coded keyboard. So we knew that Ethan can identify colors and look at patterns. So in the beginning, what I did was cut out those colored copy paper and put green on the letter E. So instead of just the keyboard with the letter E, I taped a pink paper on letter E and just wrote letter E, green on letter T, blue on letter H, yellow on letter A, and orange on letter N. So basically in front of his computer would be the different boxes. So he was just copying pink, green, blue, whatever colors I mentioned earlier, yellow, orange. So in the beginning, it was just him copying the sequence of the colors in front of him until I faded out. Instead of red, it became pink until it's almost white, until it's the color of the keyboard. So with typing, and as teachers and educators, that sometimes you could just type without looking at the keyboard. So it was more like a motor. It happened to progress to a motor memory wherein he knows exactly where letter E is, THAM. So the color-coded keyboard was the evidence-based practice that I used in order to achieve that goal for my son to type his own name. And so capitalizing on the fact that he has a good memory on patterns, that's how I started with that. And then faded the color of the patterns so that it became like a motor memory until he can type his own name and he could type his own phone number, because we use technology-aided intervention and visual supports. So that's just proof that anything is possible. I did not realize that Ethan can type until much later. I wish I knew all of these evidence-based practices when he was younger. But so now that we know this, now that we have this wealth of information in front of us, why not use it? So if you are writing your IEP goals, I suggest you look at the different implied statements or underlying conditions that I have listed for you. That way you kind of know already how to implement that goal, and that you are assured that you're using evidence-based practices in your classroom. If you have any questions or would like a copy of that chart with all the evidence-based practices and what those abbreviations or acronyms stands for, just shoot me an email. If you like a copy of that underlying conditions cheat sheet for writing IEP goals with implied evidence-based practices, just shoot me an email. This is my email right here.